Hey, my name is Josh Korak. I'm a mental health counselor in the Northern Colorado area. In this space, I get the chance to interview professionals in the field, talk about mental illness, self-care, and so much more. With this show, I ask you to join me in doing what one of my favorite philosophers, a Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, says. Smile, breathe, and go slowly. This is Care with Korak. Hey everyone, welcome back to Care with Korak. This is Josh, your host. Joining me today is the wonderful Dr. Diana Hill. A little bit about her. Dr. Hill is a clinical psychologist and expert in acceptance-based and science-backed approaches to living well. In her practice, workshops, podcasts, and mentoring, Dr. Hill uses the combined tools of compassion and acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, to help you get unstuck and live more fully. Intrigued by the intersection of brain, body, and behavior, Dr. Hill studied biopsychology, the physiology and neuroscience of behavior, as a pre-med student at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She also began practicing mindfulness and yoga to manage her struggles with anxiety and eating. Dr. Hill then pursued a PhD in clinical psychology in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and did her dissertation on appetite-focused dialectical behavioral therapy for binge eating with purging under the mentorship of Dr. Deborah Safer at the Stanford School of Medicine. She completed a year-long pre-doctoral internship in 2007 at University of California Davis Counseling and Psychological Services under the directorship of Dr. Christy Haggins. In 2008, Dr. Hill took a job as the clinical director of La Luna Center, an intensive outpatient center for eating disorders that embraces feminine and holistic integrative approaches to healing in the Northern Colorado branch. At La Luna Center, she designed the treatment program, built ACT groups, supervised doctoral students in ACT, and more. With motherhood beginning, Dr. Hill left Colorado and moved back to Santa Barbara to start a private therapy and consulting practice, raise her kids, and grow their homestead. In an effort to stay connected to the most current psychology research, she started a podcast called Psychologists Off the Clock with her friend and colleague Dr. Debbie Sorensen in 2016. Currently, Dr. Hill is the host of Your Life in Process and is the author of the ACT Daily Journal. In this episode, Dr. Hill and I talk about what acceptance and commitment therapy is, what it means to live based off of our values, and how to have psychological flexibility. For more information on Dr. Hill, make sure to check out her website at www.drdianahill.com. Dr. Hill does have an upcoming Cultivate Acceptance and Willingness with ACT event on June 10th, which you can find on her website for more information. If you're interested in learning more about ACT, Dr. Hill also has a Foundations to ACT course available on her website. Her podcast, Your Life in Process, is available wherever you find Care with Korak, so make sure to check that out as well. Follow me on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, at Josh Korak for video clips, podcast previews, and more mental health content. That about does it. Let's not waste any more time and get into it. This is Care with Korak with Dr. Diana Hill. Well, hey, Dr. Hill, thanks for coming on Care with Korak.
Thank you for having me here. It's wonderful to be here. We were just chatting about how much I love Colorado, so I love to talk with somebody in Colorado. It makes me feel a little bit at home. My second home.
Yeah, a little grounded. Yeah. Because did you say how long you spent out here?
We were there for 10 years. I was there for graduate school.
Okay.
I left for my internship. So with a doctorate, you have to go do a year-long clinical internship somewhere, and I did that at UC Davis. But then we got jobs. My husband was at CU, and I was in northern Colorado, and I ended up running a treatment center, clinical director of an eating disorder treatment center up there. So I just love Colorado. Right. It feels like a second home to us.
Well, Colorado's pretty great. California's okay, I guess, but I'm a little biased. I've been born and raised here, never left, so I'm a little bit biased. But
Yeah.
well, cool. Well, I'm so glad to have you on. Would you mind just kind of introducing yourself, sharing a little bit about what you do, where you came from, how you got to where you're at, kind of all that good stuff?
Well, gosh, that could be a few hours conversation there, but I'll give you the brief bit, which is I'm a clinical psychologist, and I guess I like to see myself as a psychological flexibility guide. And what that means is I help individuals, organizations, groups, therapists, consult therapists to live more flexibly in their lives, like how to stay grounded, how to stay open, and how to stay engaged with your values, even in the face of obstacles and uncertainty and change. And those tools have been incredibly important over the last few years, whether you're a parent or whether you're a healthcare worker or just someone trying to navigate a pandemic and global uncertainty. So I've been quite busy, and part of that is also my own psychological flexibility in my life. So I'm a mom of two, I'm a partner, and just trying to make it in this world in the best way that I can, in a compassionate way.
Yeah, that's great. So a little bit about, experience-wise, what are some of the specialties that you kind of work with?
Well, my background, my initial interest was in biopsychology, and also I did my biopsychology degree at UCSB. So really always interested in the brain and its influence on behavior and our biology. But I ended up researching eating disorders, and that was very much because of my own history of recovery from an eating disorder. I had anorexia when I was a teenager and into college, and it really shaped and influenced my life and my career and my decision to want to go on to help folks that were struggling with eating disorders.
Right.
And at the time, when I entered into my PhD program, there was very little research in the arena of mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches to eating disorders. This was back in 2002. There was probably just maybe like one study on mindfulness and eating disorders, just a handful of studies looking at DBT, dialectical behavior therapy.
Right.
And so when I actually went to graduate school, I was studying appetite awareness training. So how to make contact, your interoceptive awareness, how to make contact with your body to help guide your eating. And it was really just a launching point for me because it led down this path of how to integrate more mindfulness, body-based, and acceptance-based approaches to recovery.
Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, a lot of what I'm hearing is very similar to some of the work I do. I do a lot of work with trauma, and so I do a lot of interoceptive, a lot of mindfulness-based work around there. So it's interesting for me to kind of think about this through an eating disorder or disordered eating. Is there a right way to kind of talk about and label those things?
In terms of labeling an eating disorder?
Eating disorders, disordered eating. I don't know if there's like one.
Oh, gosh. Labels, words can be problematic whichever way you turn,
Right.
I think culturally we have, whether you are diagnosed with an eating disorder or body dysmorphia or whatever the DSM wants to put you, box he wants to put you in, I think that many of us are very disconnected from our bodies. And so that can show up in the form of an eating disorder, but I think it can also just show up in the form of when you're in an intimate relationship and you're so much in your head, you have lost track of what's happening in your body or even your intuition or your, sort of inner knowing. And many times I'll work with clients and just sort of say, like, how much of your day are you spent in your head versus how much of your day you're spent in your body? And for most of us, our body can be a very foreign thing. So eating disorders was where I started, and that's in part because of my own history and my own desire to help people. But it's really evolved over time where now I'm working with folks in a, sort of this psychological flexibility or ACT model to help people identify what their values are and how to live their life in alignment with those values. And oftentimes that involves some kind of check-in with your body, like, what are my values? What do I kind of know inside of me that's not a should or an expectation or an external rule or what my head is telling me, but I know from more of an inner awareness and more of a heart space of what's right for me and what I want my life to be about. And that can look like, checking in with yourself if you have an addiction or if you have an eating disorder or if you're just trying to navigate being a human on this planet.
Right. Yeah. How often are you finding when you're working with clients that there is this large disconnection between body and mind and spirit?
All the time. I mean, I think, I struggle with it, and I've been practicing yoga for over 20 years. And, there'll be times where I have completely disconnected from my body. So I think it's quite common. And part of the reason why is, obviously there's social cultural influences that pull us out of our body. So a lot of things are designed to take our attention away from our inner world, whether that's, diets, take our attention away from our hunger and fullness, or whether it's things like our technology, right, that takes us away from being, in our bodies. But there's also another element to the body, which I think is interesting, which is we often find it quite uncomfortable and foreign and sort of this like wilderness of whether that's our emotions inside of our body can feel really scary to folks, or physical sensations. And what's interesting is that a lot of the research around everything from chronic pain to how to deal with things like trauma has to do now with how do we approach and be with whatever's showing up under our skin. And that is a skill set that many of us don't have because we spend a lot of times trying to run away from what's showing up inside of us.
Yeah. Why is that? Like, over the years that you've worked in this kind of area, what have you found in terms of why do we feel so uncomfortable in our body? Like, what are some of those factors that may play a role into just that body discomfort that a lot of us have?
There's a psychiatrist at Stanford, Anna Lemke, who she wrote the book Dopamine Nation, and I got the opportunity to interview her on my podcast. And she described something that I hadn't heard of it this way, which was really helpful to me, was sort of the concept of nature, nurture, and neighborhood. Right? So
nature, nurture, and neighborhood.
So nature being our biology. And our brains and biology are designed to avoid discomfort and pain. We are the ancestors of the folks that were really good at like running when something was painful and finding safety, right? And so when it comes to physical pain, it makes a lot of sense to avoid things, acute pain, And then nurture has to do with what we were taught. About our bodies, about emotions, what culturally, I identify as a woman in Western society. Women are often culturally taught from a very young age that things like anger are not things to be expressed and really not something that I should feel, right? I have two young boys, and, one of them is 9. And so here are two boys. My husband has his PhD in education, and his specialty is in diversity and inclusion in education and math, right? And then mom is the psychologist that like works with feelings, right? So you can imagine what my two boys are like finger knitting, and they're like super not genderized, but they're on baseball teams. And last couple weekends ago, I was at a baseball game, and my 9-year-old didn't run when his coach told him to run from one base to the next, right? And he ended up getting out because he kind of like halfway ran and didn't really finish up. And the coach gave him a talking to between innings. And he went back to the dugout, and I was looking, I'm like the mom looking in the dugout. How's my little boy doing? My little 9-year-old kid. And I could just see him holding back his tears so intensely. Like he was like bracing his body, holding his breath, like his eyes were like, staring straight ahead. Like, please do not let me cry right now.
Right.
Right. So if you're a boy, or if you identify as a boy, or someone identifies you as a boy, they're going to tell you don't cry. Right. So that's the neighborhood. Like what's happening in our neighborhood. I'm sorry, our nurture. What's happening in our nurturing environments around our emotions. And then neighborhood is sort of what we have access to in terms of what's available to us, to be able to deal with our emotions, our coping skills, our ways in which we can express. And so in all of those, really, I think at least in Western culture, there is an emphasis on control emotions. Certain things are good to show, other things are not, and get rid of them, really, if you can.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Long story.
I didn't mean to interrupt. No, that was great. That was perfect. I mean, it makes sense to me, right? I mean, for so long it's been such a conversation around, is it nature or is it nurture? And really it's both, right? And I love that idea of this neighborhood, right, of what's available to us. And for some people there isn't a lot, right? I mean, I know, at least for my clients coming in, which I know I'm still pretty early on in my career, but and I'm sure this is the same for you, but so many of my clients who are coming in have next to nothing in terms of coping skills, right? They don't know how to manage their feelings. They don't know how to manage the discomfort in their body. They don't know how to deal with any of that. So what are kind of the next steps? They're coming in to see you. They have all this baggage, right? Where do you start to take them?
Well, in a ACT model, acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the things that we start with is something called creative hopelessness. And gosh, you'd think that's sort of a terrible thing for your therapist to say, is that we're hopeless. But creative hopelessness is the idea that what you've been doing to get you here, some of the things have been really effective and wonderful and you're flourishing in your life, but some things are really kind of hopeless. Things like trying to control your emotions and make them go away. We have plenty of research to show that emotional suppression leads to stronger emotions. Things like trying to control your thoughts and not think about a thought. That's like my most frequent request from clients is, can you just help me stop thinking about my ex? Can you just help me stop thinking about my belly? Can you just help me stop thinking about how much I want to, use right now? No, actually I can't. I'm not that kind of therapist. You can probably get something to help you stop thinking, but unfortunately it's going to stop some other things that you care about, like living. So one thing that I start with is just looking at the workability and helping people identify the ways in which they're operating in their lives that is no longer working. And then from there, we have a launching point of some alternative paths. And those alternative paths are things that at times can feel very paradoxical. So for example, if someone's coming in that's highly anxious, anxiety tells you to avoid, but the way out of anxiety is actually to go towards the very thing that you're afraid of. So that's an alternative path. It's like uses things like acceptance and allowing and being present with. Some of those core processes that we know are involved in human flourishing. Those that can practice acceptance and being present and mindful with discomfort are actually more resilient, right? So with anxiety, we may approach. We may try an alternative path with something like depression, because what does depression tell you to do? Isolate, crawl back in bed, maybe drink a few. And those very things are the things that make depression worse. So I may work with someone that's very depressed to look at biopsychospiritual models to help them get some behavioral activation in their life. And ultimately, the work that I do with clients is about values. And it's about what would be a rich and meaningful and fulfilling life to you. What does that look like? And then how can we act on those values? How can we take committed action towards those right here, right now, today, so that we are putting those little drops in a bucket to eventually sort of build that life that you want to live.
Right. I love how much ACT focuses on values. I'm still learning a lot about it. I wouldn't say that I'm like actively practicing acceptance and commitment therapy, but I will say that almost with almost all of my clients, or if I haven't done it yet, I know I will be doing it. I love doing the value card sort and having them kind of discover their own values and like what that looks like for them. And it's fun for me because it's always different, right? But then we kind of narrow down like what's their top 5 values. And I don't know if this is similar to what you do with your clients, but and then I always check in. I say, okay, so how are your values being met? Right? How are those values being filled in your life? And then how are they not? right? Where do you feel like life is just missing, right? With some of these values that you've identified are some of the most important things to you. How does that, or I guess, where do you take that forward in terms of once you've identified values with your clients? How do you take that and run with it?
Yeah, I think values card sorts are really fun to do, especially with clients that need to have a word to put on a value. So they need to have words like creativity or kindness or engagement or adventure, right? Those are values. And where I see those as a launching point, because what I see values as is something that you embody and you live out. So say, for example, you really value being present. That's like something you value. I was reading through your website. I was like, oh, he's like a Thich Nhat Hanh guy. I can like hang with him. I love Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yep.
I went to Plum Village in my 20s. I grew up with Thich Nhat Hanh. My dad was like a super follower. So he'd go to Plum Village every summer, and actually we're bringing our kids there.
I was wondering, I mean, you can't not be into mindfulness and not love Thich Nhat Hanh.
Okay, so you love being present, right? And that's something you value. Then the next question is, okay, so how are you embodying that in our interview right now? Like if I were to you are videotaping this. People will watch this. And people were to say, okay, he's a super present interviewer. What would be the qualities that you would be acting on? Like, how would that look, right? So, or if you were videoing someone that was in a partnership or a friendship or at work, what would that being present look like? Because for me, values don't end at the word. That's where it starts. And sometimes we can't even put a word on it. Like, I can't even put a word on the value of what it feels like when I'm engaging with my mom, and I'm like actually like listening to her and not judging her, and I'm not criticizing her, and I'm just appreciating her. It's like a lot of words, right? But I can feel the feeling of what it's like and how I'm acting. And what's interesting about values and the reason why it's so fun to be a therapist is because oftentimes what's most painful to us is what points to our values. So when somebody's coming into therapy, there's something that they care about that brought them there. There's a value. There's a way in which they're living in the world that is maybe discrepant from how they want to be in the world. And that pain, that discomfort, that loss is contributing to their dissatisfaction in life. And when we have that understanding of like, oh, okay, wait a minute, what bothers me most is often linked to my values, then we actually have something to work with there, because we can harness and harvest the values and start using those to act on instead of getting stuck in the bother.
Stuck in the bother.
Yes, in the pain.
Interesting. I like that.
So it's a way of, and the flip side of that is I'll also, when I work a lot with training therapists and ACT. It's like sort of semi of my many side hustles. And what I love to do is I'll like put therapists into pairs, and I'll give them this exercise. And you could actually even do this with partners too, or friends, is I'll tell one therapist, okay, so your job is to describe to the other therapist a moment from yesterday that was the most meaningful moment of the day. Even if the listeners think about this, like, what was the most meaningful moment of the day? Josh, what was the most meaningful moment of yesterday for you?
The most meaningful moment of yesterday. Geez, now I'm trying to remember yesterday, right? I would probably say... Well, okay, so I would say I had a client yesterday who I just started to re-see. Like, she had stopped for a while and then has come back. And so we were finishing up an intake appointment, and just tears coming down, right? Talking about a lot of trauma, talking a lot about family dysfunction, different things like that. And so just being in that moment and being able to sit with that and just... just appreciating my role in that space and being able to honor that it was really meaningful just to be there and to be a part of that.
Yeah.
So
super precious.
That was probably the most meaningful.
Yeah, very precious
yesterday.
that we get to share in those moments with our clients. And so So in this exercise, you'll ask one therapist to describe the most meaningful moment. And then the other therapist's job, that would be my job as I'm listening to you, is to be a values highlighter and to look for, as somebody's talking about something that's meaningful to them, be able to look for what it is that they care about. What are their values? And even you just sharing that story, Josh, I get a hit of what's important to you. And so my hit is you value vulnerability. And maybe you also value being present with somebody while they're vulnerable. You value presence. And once we can kind of boil it down to like, okay, so Josh, you value vulnerability and you value being present with somebody when they're vulnerable. The next question is, when, and you could do this in therapy or maybe outside of your life, when is it hard for you to be present with vulnerability, Josh? Where in your life is it hard to do that? Because I imagine you can do it with that client, but maybe there's some other hiding holes of you that it's like, that's hard. Maybe it's with,
Sure. Yeah.
You don't have to share, but you
I
can.
can speak to that. No, I'd love to share. Oh gosh, now I feel like I'm in a session right now.
Go for
it. No, honestly, yeah. I mean, it is a lot easier for me to be present with vulnerability when I'm with clients, but a lot more difficult. It takes a lot more mindfulness. It takes a lot more personal work for me to do the same thing when it comes to being in relationship with people who are close to me, whether that's, my girlfriend, whether that's my family, close friends. Being present with my own vulnerability. It's okay when it's their vulnerability, I think, but with my own vulnerability, that becomes a lot more difficult.
Right. Good.
Yeah.
So then we'd find, if you were my client, which you're not, so I won't take it that far.
Right.
But then we'd find like,
That's okay.
Okay, so here's this thing that you value so much. And then here's these places in your life where it's hard to bring that value to life. And what's cool about ACT or this psychological flexibility approach is, okay, so now we found, sort of this spot. Josh has a hard time being present with vulnerability in himself. And there's these other core processes that can help with that. So in ACT, there's these 6 core processes that make up your psychological flexibility. And this is when Debbie Sorensen and I wrote the ACT Daily Journal, we broke it down like process by process. Values is one of them. But there's another process that may be helpful, which is acceptance. And acceptance is how do we stay with the discomfort that shows up under our skin in our bodies that we want to shut down around when we're pursuing our values. Because what's interesting is that the more that you care about something, the more likely you're going to experience this discomfort and just the vulnerability of being human, right? So if you go bowling, you don't care if you lose or look like an idiot. Most people, unless you're like a bowling star.
Right.
But you care a lot in other situations, right? Of this kind of performance. So we'd move through some of these other processes, which are things like acceptance. There's another process that involves how do we work with our thoughts that give us a hard time when we're trying to pursue, for you, being vulnerable with yourself, being present with yourself when you're vulnerable, because there's probably a lot of thoughts involved. And there's a whole skill set around that called cognitive diffusion. So that's where psychological flexibility can be really helpful in helping people identify their values, but then actually what I'm interested in is, okay, now you know what they are. What are you going to do?
That's great. It seems like you've really just honed down and you've just made this such an integral part of your therapy and your work with clients. I love it. It's so cool.
Yeah, I love it. I've been living and breathing it for a long time. So
that's great.
What's interesting is that it kind of evolves. You evolve as a therapist over time. And I think that I've evolved as a therapist from in my early days, just being super theoretical and super into like wanting to understand the models and the theory and the research. And these days I am just like so applied. So like what works in your life right now, get flexible, get out of the like diagnostic categories and the worksheets and the handouts and the exercises and just like help people live this. And be able to tailor it to their unique context and circumstances, because every single person is so different. They have so many different things that are influencing their struggles and their successes in life. And we as therapists are all so different, and we all have our own skill sets that are different. So we have to kind of embrace and support all of that diversity, really.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, it sounds like, this is a huge part of your therapy, but it's not the only part, right? You are a diverse therapist. And could you just spend a little bit of time maybe talking about how you incorporate yoga into therapy?
Yeah, yoga is sort of an interesting story for me in that yoga was a really integral part of my recovery. And before I went to graduate school, I was studying a lot of yoga. It was very much part of my healing journey. And then when I got to graduate school, I was in this really intense PhD program. And the way that these PhD programs work is it's like you with 6 other crazy, smart, competitive, in my case, women, which is the majority of psychology graduate programs these days, a lot of women. And my first year of graduate school, so I was in this like competitive, prestigious program, and very cognitive behaviorally based. And I started to relapse. So here I was studying eating disorders, relapsing. And I had made a commitment before I went to graduate school to 2 things. The first commitment was my recovery comes first. And the second commitment was my purpose here is to serve. And I wasn't fulfilling either of those commitments, or maybe in some ways I fulfilled those commitments because I withdrew. And so, to get into these PhD programs, it's like the top 1% that gets into these things. And, it's just like this hugely prestigious, you work your behind off to get there. And
especially CU Boulder, right?
CU Boulder.
That's a top-notch school especially for psychology. I mean, they're just so well known for their research and clinical psychology.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I remember the day calling my advisor and telling her I have to stop, I have to leave. And so I had the benefit of going to graduate school in CU Boulder, which also top graduate school in psychology, but like Mecca for spiritual enlightenment. And so I went up to the El Dorado Mountain School of Yoga, ashram there in South Boulder. And I spent that year living and learning from the ashram, something that I already knew that I needed, right? Which was, I need to get back in my body, and I need to understand the role of is really biopsycho-spiritual. It's all of it. Social, biopsychosocial, spiritual.
Right.
And and so that really has influenced my work in that when I think about yoga, I don't think about it just as the asanas of the physical postures, because actually much of my study wasn't a physical one at all. It was very much the psychology of yoga and the practices of non-attachment, the practices of ahimsa, not harming, the yamas and the niyamas, which are the ethical principles of yoga that teach us things like how to balance, discipline, like the importance of discipline, but it being a compassionate discipline, right? So in a lot of ways, that really melds beautifully with ACT, because ACT has a lot of sort of, it has a lot of contemplative, it sort of aligns with a lot of contemplative practice. But what it will look like in my session can be very different for every single client. It may be something where I'm working with someone with breath work. I would actually teach different forms of breath work, things like alternate nostril breathing, things like breath retention, to actually help us with our vagus nerve, with our nervous system, to help us soothe our bodies. For other clients, if I were to ask them to do some breath work with me, like I work with executives, and I'm here in Santa Barbara, so it's like producers and
Sure.
like lots of famous people that I don't even know who they are because I don't Google my clients, but then they have to tell me a few sessions in. I'm like, oh, okay.
That's pretty fun,
yeah, it's
though.
pretty funny. But with them, I'm not, with some folks, I would never throw breath work at them, but I'm just helping them to start to notice their feet on the floor and the seat in the chair, and that there is something below the neck. And that in some ways is body. Or I'm working with things like around non-attachment to ego, but in a much more subtle way, not using the Sanskrit terms for things like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's just, for me, there's just so much to unpack there. I mean, so yoga has just played such a personal, it's been a tool for you to use in your own personal recovery, your own personal journey in mental health, but also you've taken that and now you're saying, well, this has worked for me, so it makes sense for me to use it with clients.
Yeah. And in my parenting. My kids,
yeah.
I mentioned I have these 2 baseball player boys, but ever since they were little, we've chanted together. And very much part of my practice is kirtan, which is chanting. And there's a good amount of research now that shows that actually the rhythm of kirtan slows your breath down to that sort of ideal breath state that Nestor talks about in the book Breath, where it's like 5 count in, 5 count out. A lot of those mantras naturally do that, which is really great for your nervous system, your physiology, all those things.
Right.
But I've been chanting with my boys ever since they're little, and we sing these chants together. And during the pandemic, when I homeschooled my kids, I was like, hey, Mama's in charge of curriculum now. So we're going to learn some Sanskrit. And it was fantastic because now sometimes my 12-year-old, I'll hear him. You can hear him in the other room, and I'll hear him late at night, and he'll be singing a chant when he can't sleep at night to get him to bed. And if any of his friends knew this, oh my goodness, he would be so embarrassed. But I know that it's instilled some practices for them, some tools for them that I hope they will use lifelong,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just feel like the more I read about these different things that you're talking about, the more it just seems that research is just saying this is where we need to be going in terms of therapy and treatment. Like thinking of The Body Keeps the Score, even with Van der Kolk, he talks a lot about just a lot of these physical, body, somatic-oriented therapies, whether it's simple things like yoga or even massage therapy, right? There's just so much more evidence pointing we need to be doing chanting, we need to be doing these different body-based practices if we want to see some differences in our anxiety, our stress, our depression, right? Because so much of it does stem from our body, right? The threat responses that our body can have can really just jack us up, right? So it's really cool to see that you're applying this to yourself, you're applying this to your clients, you're applying this to your family, and you're just making this such a holistic practice for your life.
Yes, I think that psychology has done a pretty poor job, and no offense to white males, but in part
no offense taken, I'll speak for us.
The patriarchy that has driven psychology for so long, where a lot of things, it's been very individualistic in its approach. It has, I think I went to actually a counseling internship, in a counseling center. And man, I learned a lot about multicultural approaches, about it's not just about the individual and it's the individual's fault, right? About context and how that influences our mental health and our social relationships and, all sorts of environmental factors. But the other arena that's really been, I think, discounted and not paid attention to is the role of the body in our mental health. Everything from I'll work with a client who's like depressed and anxious and, I'm working on let's cognitively diffuse that thought. Let's, whatever, let's practice this breathing exercise. And they'll come back to my session one day and they'll say things like, I just feel so much better. I am just like doing great. And I'll be like, what do you think is contributing to that? You know, which ones?
Right.
And they'll say things like, well, I started pickleball twice a week with this group of friends.
Which is great.
And it changed my life. And I'm like, yes, because we know that physical exercise and social connection is foundational in your mood, in changing how you feel. And, you know, we just have negated these things, or things like your microbiome in terms of your anxiety and the link between diversity of the microbiome and your anxiety or your mental health, that we're only at the sort of the edges of understanding research wise. But I do think the research is heading in that direction and taking a much more holistic, integrative view of things. But it makes people feel a little bit uncomfortable because many of these things people have discounted or thought is kind of like woo-woo.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right. You know, that's something I'm I'm starting to more regularly check in with my clients about, is just the social connections. Like, I'm really glad you brought that piece up. You know, research has shown that one of the biggest factors that leads to post-traumatic growth is our re-engagement in social relationships. And so, you know, just the other day, I checked in with a client who I hadn't seen in like a week or two, and I was like, so, you know, how's it been going, friends? Have you guys hung out recently? Like, what have you guys been up to? And he's kind of just like, why are you asking me that? It felt like an uncomfortable question for him. And for me, it was like, let's just check in about friends. But for him, it was kind of uncomfortable. And so it's interesting as the counselor, like, how many clients sometimes don't even think about, you know, their social life and how important of a role that can play in their mental health.
Yeah. You know, I've been keeping tabs on the APA Stress in America survey. It's a survey that the APA did yearly for a long time, but then come 2020, they started doing it monthly. And, and starting to look at all these different variables that are contributing to our stress. So things that you would predict, like I think it was June of 2020, 72% of Americans said this is the worst point in history that they could ever remember. Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
Summer 2020 just like was
makes sense.
Pretty bottomed out for folks. But there was other things that were coming out from that survey that were interesting. And things like 4 out of 5 parents reported that they were grateful for time with their kids. 3 out of 5 Americans were reporting that they were taking action against racism and social justice, right? So at these really, really low points of our life, we're doing some things and those are social things, right? That are meaningful and engaged in a sense of purpose, in a sense of greater purpose, a sense of compassion, a sense of connection that actually can help us navigate the lowest of lows. And it's often we don't think about the power of that, like the power of finding meaningful engagement, and especially meaningful engagement that's connected to someone else. And even the power of, if you are super depressed and down, doing something for someone else and how that can make you feel so different. I mean, we know this as therapists. I can be having the crappiest morning of my life and then go into a session with a client and feel alive and invigorated just from an hour of caring for another person. But we also know that in terms of the research on volunteer work and its benefit for mental health and, you know, all sorts of things. So, yeah, social engagement is really, really important.
Yeah. Well said. You know, it makes me wonder, like, my last season I had Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas, who does a lot of work around suicide risk and suicide loss survivors. And she informed us that, which was kind of a surprise to me, that the suicide rates did not dramatically increase. They didn't increase at all. They didn't decrease per se too much, but they kind of just stayed the same throughout COVID. Which was really interesting to me and to my audience, because it makes me wonder if how much of a role social connections play in that, with the grouping together during COVID and being around family and friends, hopefully a little bit more throughout this time.
Yeah, I'd want to look at moderating variables too. So moderating variables being variables that impact that relationship, because what some of the studies are showing around mental health is that there are variables that show that time during COVID was not the same for everybody, So
right.
Generation Zers, oh man, they got hit the worst. Like Generation
Right.
Z, their mental health, and actually the latest March 2022 survey that came out, they were looking at race as well as gender, as well as generation. And it's actually, in terms of the stress on Americans, the baby boomers and the older adults are faring pretty well.
Interesting.
And part of that is, maybe they're not facing the same kind of like immensity of what is happening to our future. What's the future of our planet? What's the future of our, economy? And now, global instability, that Generation Zers, Generation Xers, and millennials are kind of left with this responsibility. And so it's stressful, it's hard. And, and then we know that also people of color, people with lower economic resources, healthcare workers, and parents fared really poorly. There was some behaviors that they were looking at, increase in alcohol use. And it was something like a quarter of Americans reported using more alcohol, but 50% of parents reported using more alcohol during the pandemic. Because
I believe it.
It's like, how are you going to get through that rest of the end of your day when you've been with your kids all day and working? So it's just, we got to look at moderating variables with all of this in terms of, what's impacting who and how, and context really matters.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It is going to just differ based on where you're at. And like you said, those different factors around race and culture and gender and those different things. And even just age, like you were saying, I think what I'm seeing has been getting hit the most in terms of the social relationship aspect is our youngest generations, right? When they're being pulled out of school as long as they did and having to do online for so long. I'm seeing clients now, 2 years, not post-COVID, but 2 years through this process of COVID, and they're hurting. They're, they don't have the same social relationships that I did when I was in school, that you probably did, I'm assuming, in school. And it's because they were isolated. They were able to maybe see them online, but it's just not the same as those in-person relationships that are so instrumental when you're younger.
Yeah. What we're going to see is these sort of like unusual outgrowths of really beautiful things, really unexpected beautiful things, and then really unexpected tragic things. So, yesterday I had a full day of clients. My kids were home because it was like in-service day. My partner was at work. I work, this little office is on our property, and I started seeing folks out of this office during COVID.
I love it. It's got such a nice aesthetic.
It's like this little redwood building in the forest.
Yeah.
But so my kids were home all day, and I go up like halfway through the day to like see what's happening up there. And my 12-year-old is making challah bread. I'm not kidding you.
No way.
This is a COVID outgrowth, right? Is all of a sudden you have to figure out how to cook, kid, because you're home 3 meals a day and mom is not. I'm working and I cannot cook 3 meals. I'll cook you dinner and I'll maybe do some leftovers in a lunch for breakfast.
So he's making some challah.
So he's making some challah, and he gets little consults. And I'm a big cook and baker and all that. So they've been baking bread with me since they were little. But these are the types of outgrowths that we're going to see, these unusual sort of strengths that we developed, that our children developed, that these strengthening of relationships that we didn't expect. I mean, you're talking about post-traumatic growth, all of those, things like appreciation for life and deepening of connections and spirituality. Superimposed on some real deficits. Like, I was responsible for my second grader learning how to read and write. And let me tell you, he's going to have like poor penmanship for life. He's done for. He cannot read his writing because mom does not know how to teach handwriting. But But
Sure.
you know, they can make some challah. So I would rather have someone know how to make challah in the long run.
Well, and they're probably going to be way better off in terms of self-regulation and all that good stuff that you've taught them. But that, to me, that is, I grew up Jewish actually, and so to me, that is the funniest thing. It's the best kind of bread, bread around.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's great. What are some, if you'd be willing to share, what are some like practical, just a couple of practical coping skills maybe that you'd be willing to share that you work on with clients or that you use yourself in your daily life that kind of center around this idea of psychological flexibility?
You know, the skill that I use the most and that I teach the most to therapists and to clients and to my kids is something called one eye in and one eye out. And you can do it with your eyes open. So you can do this at the grocery store. You can do it while you're sitting, you know, next to someone you love, or when you're sitting next to someone you're in a fight with. And you start with two eyes in. So two eyes in is like, what's going on in my body right now? What's my inner landscape? What's my breath like? Where are there areas of tension? What emotions are showing up for me right now? Am I hungry? What are my biological needs? Two eyes in. And then you shift to two eyes out, which is, can I acknowledge the person that's with me? Can I see them as a human with their own inner landscape and inner world and context that's happening for them? But can I also do some two eyes out? You know, looking at the horizon activates parts of our brain that are associated with being more interconnected.
Really?
Evolutionarily, we look at the horizon, you know, to see what's out there. Where are we going to go? What are we connected to, right? So two eyes out to look at nature, two eyes out to just look at the world around you. And then ultimately, can I toggle back and forth with one eye in and one eye out? Can I stay connected to me and what's happening inside of me, make room and space for my full experience, tend to things when they need to be tended to, make space for things when they need space to be made? And then can I have another eye out that's connected to the world around me, including people that I'm with, and tend to the things that need to be tended to, make space for things that need space for, and maybe appreciate both.
I love that. That's great. That makes me think of, you know, going back to our boy Thich Nhat Hanh. I just read his The Miracle of Mindfulness, and it makes me think of that story he shares. I don't know if you've read it, but it's the story. I don't know if it has a specific name. It's not even his story. It's a story by Tolstoy, maybe. But it's the story of the emperor who goes up to the wise man in the mountains and talks about how he's going up there to get the answer to three questions, right? What's the most important way for us to spend our time? Like, who's the most important people for us to be around? And what's the most important thing for us to be doing? Or something to that effect. And it's this whole long story, but basically kind of boils down to this idea of mindfulness, right? Where you're at right now is like the most important time. Who you're with right now is the most important person you should be with. And what you're doing with them is what is the most important thing to be doing.
Yeah.
So what you're sharing just makes me think a lot about that. Like we're being mindful of what's going on with ourselves internally, our needs, our desires, while also being able to recognize what's in front of us and being present in that space.
Yeah. You know, Ty, I mentioned I had the opportunity to study with him in my 20s, and my mom and my now husband and I went to Pundaluj together, and he would give these Dharma talks. He was like back in the day where he just wasn't popular, you know, but he'd give these Dharma talks, and he'd always have a pot of tea with him during the talk. And he would be talking, and then he would stop. It would, like, everything would stop. And he'd pour the little cup of tea, and then he'd lift it up, he'd take a sip, he'd finish drinking it. We'd all be just watching him, like just hanging, watching him drink his tea,
right.
his sip, and then put it down. And then he'd start the talk again. And it was that he would not drink the tea while talking, because he wanted to pay attention to the tea and he wanted to pay attention to the talk.
Right.
And so everything that he did, all these subtle things, everything from when he rang the bell, he would do something called warming up the bell, where he'd take his little thing and he'd touch it gently just to let the bell know, I'm going to ring you now. I don't want to startle you. Bell.
Oh my goodness.
And so he'd warm it up, and he would teach us, you must warm up the bell before you ring the bell, And so now whenever I ring my bell, like before meditation, I'm like, I better warm it up.
You got to warm up the bell.
But we got to think about that for ourselves, right? That we've lost the subtlety of things, like how we don't warm ourselves up, right? To all sorts of things in life, we don't warm each other up. We just like put the big, like, conflictual issue on the table with our partner when they walk in the door from work and they're like, there was no warming up there. Of course, they're going to not respond well to this. So these teachings of mindfulness are quite simple, but when you look at them deeply, they are profound. They will profoundly change your life.
Yeah. I mean, it really is such a buzzword right now. I feel like in pop culture, like, oh, just practice mindfulness, just do this, right? But when you actually do it, when you actually practice it, and you practice it with how it's intended to be practiced, it's profound. Like you said, it's changing. It'll make an impact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great. I mean, so what's next for you? What are you working on? I'm curious, you've got so much that you've done, so much that you're doing. What are you working on right now?
I'm working on scaling back and resting more.
Yeah.
So I've been doing this podcast. I mentioned I left a really big podcast that got too big, and I'm like, it's too big. I want things to be small. So I have this podcast, Your Life in Process, that is super applied, and it's super meaningful to me because I just want to like be of service. Going back to those 2 commitments of graduate school, those are at the forefront of my mind. I'm also interested in these days a lot more in the concept of striving, and I've been writing a lot on that and considering writing a book about striving and how to be a high achiever and engaged, which is ever like my struggle in life, is like how to pursue big things that I care about without falling apart.
Yeah.
This is ever my struggle. So I think that ACT can help a lot with that, with high achievers, with strivers, whether you're a striving parent or a striving graduate student or a, whatever striver in the world of social justice, that how do we practice that psychological flexibility in that arena?
Yeah.
And so I'm just thinking about that. I'm contemplating it and how to write a book about striving without striving.
Oh, that'd be great. I know that I would definitely devour that kind of book. I know I could probably use a little bit more insight there. So that's great. Well, I'm going to make sure to link your podcast and all of your other stuff, your book, your ACT book in the episode description. And so it's cool to see the work you're doing. And I love that you just your heart in all of this. I just want to say, like, there are so many out there, right, who are just focused maybe more on production and getting things out just to get it out. And it seems like your heart is really about service. And I think that's so special, right? I think if we had more of that in the world, then it would definitely be looking a little different. So,
yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you for this opportunity, Josh. Thanks for playing my client a little bit midway through. That was fun.
No, that was great. That was different. That was a lot of fun. So, well, I always like to, end it by kind of leaving it open. Is there any kind of last remarks, any last words of wisdom, if you will, that you want to kind of just impart for my audience?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how wise I am at this point in my life, but I guess the takeaway is just really, what are you committed to? What do you want to commit to? And getting clear on what your commitments are, and they can be personal and chosen, and they don't have to be super impressive, but make them meaningful.
Well said. Sounds pretty wise to me. So. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hill. I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy, and so this was truly a gift. So thank you.
Thank you.